As a 34-year-old lead software architect in Seattle, Clara expected a quiet birthday evening after a grueling week of coding, but instead found her husband, Mark, and her mother-in-law, Eleanor, blocking the entryway with a finalized property deed. Beside them stood a much younger woman, her hand resting protectively over a visibly pregnant belly, sneering at the custom furniture Clara had purchased with her own corporate bonuses. The heavy parchment paper in Mark's hand bore the official recording stamp of King County, proving that the brutal scenario unfolding was completely legally binding and immediate. "This house doesn't belong to you anymore," Mark stated, his tone completely flat and devoid of the affection he had faked for a decade. He tossed the packet onto the granite kitchen counter, the very counter Clara had meticulously selected during their expensive winter renovation. The documents laid out the catastrophic truth in stark black ink. Just 4 weeks prior, Mark had convinced Clara to sign what he claimed were routine mortgage refinance papers to secure a better interest rate through JP Morgan Chase. Trusting the man she had built a stable life with, she had scrawled her signature on the dotted lines without a single second thought. Now, staring at the notarized pages, she realized the refinance documents were a carefully orchestrated trap. It was a quitclaim deed, entirely surrendering her equity and ownership rights to Mark and Eleanor without any compensation. The sheer audacity of the betrayal paralyzed her vocal cords. She had paid the massive down payment. She had carried the primary mortgage while Mark struggled for years to get his independent consulting business off the ground. Now, on the exact evening of her birthday, she was standing in her own home as an unwanted trespasser. Eleanor stepped forward, her arms crossed, radiating a sickening sense of ultimate triumph. The older woman had always harbored a deep, simmering resentment toward Clara, viewing her demanding technical career as a direct insult to traditional family values. For years, Eleanor had subtly undermined her, dropping passive-aggressive hints about her priorities, but this current situation was a masterstroke of calculated malice. Eleanor calmly and ruthlessly explained that Mark needed a proper family, a biological heir, something Clara had supposedly failed to provide because she was too busy staring at computer screens. The pregnant woman beside them was the ultimate prize, the fertile replacement who would now enjoy the luxurious life Clara had single-handedly financed and maintained. Clara reached into her trench coat pocket and pulled out her smartphone, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened her primary banking application. She bypassed the security prompt, desperate for a shred of reassurance. The screen refreshed, revealing a balance of $0 in their shared joint savings account. She refreshed the application again, assuming it was a network error, but the brutal reality remained unchanged. Every single dollar she earned had been systematically funneled away over the past few months. Mark had slowly and quietly drained the funds, transferring them to an undisclosed offshore account or an unreachable private trust, leaving her completely destitute. The financial violence was absolute and overwhelming. They had not just stolen her physical property. They had erased her entire financial safety net in one coordinated strike. Mark pointed aggressively toward the hallway staircase, demanding she pack only her personal clothing and leave the premises immediately. He threatened to call the local Seattle Police Department and have her forcibly and publicly removed for trespassing if she hesitated for even a moment. He held absolutely all the cards. The law, entirely blind to the emotional deception and focusing only on the legally signed and notarized signatures, would instantly side with the names currently listed on the official property deed. Clara knew that fighting them right now, in this living room, screaming and crying like a broken victim, would only give them the sick emotional satisfaction they so clearly craved. She was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and legally cornered with no immediate escape route. Moving with a hollow, completely robotic precision, Clara walked up the polished oak staircase. The pregnant woman actually followed her halfway up the steps, loudly complaining to Mark about wanting to redecorate the master bedroom immediately and demanding they throw out Clara's designer bedsheets. Clara ignored the vicious taunts, focusing entirely on putting one foot in front of the other. She pulled a single hard-shell suitcase from the walk-in closet and began mechanically tossing in her professional business attire, her high-end laptop, and her critical backup hard drives. Her engineering career was the only tangible thing they could not legally seize from her. Eleanor hovered stubbornly in the doorway of the bedroom, her sharp, unblinking eyes tracking every single movement to ensure Clara did not attempt to take any of the expensive diamond jewelry or valuable consumer electronics they now considered their own personal property. The suffocating silence in the room was broken only by the sound of zippers and shifting fabric. Clara absolutely refused to shed a single tear in front of these parasites. The initial, crushing wave of disbelief was already rapidly hardening into something incredibly cold, dark, and metallic deep within her chest. She zipped the suitcase closed, the sharp sound echoing loudly against the hardwood floor. She walked right past Eleanor without acknowledging her physical existence, carrying the heavy bag down the stairs with a straight spine. Mark was waiting impatiently by the front door, holding it wide open, letting the freezing Washington state wind blow dead leaves into the pristine foyer. "Do not come back here ever again," Eleanor warned from the top of the stairs, her voice dripping with venomous, victorious satisfaction. Clara stepped out into the freezing rain, holding nothing but a small suitcase and her completely shattered reality. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind her, the brass deadbolt clicking loudly into place like a final judgment. She stood alone on the wet, slippery pavement, the bitter cold seeping through her wool coat, staring blankly at the warmly lit windows of the beautiful house she had bled for. She watched the dark silhouettes of Mark, Eleanor, and the new pregnant mistress moving around inside the living room, celebrating their cruel victory with poured glasses of expensive champagne Clara had bought for her own birthday. She pulled out her phone and ordered a ride through the Uber application, realizing with a sharp pang of humiliation that she had to use an old, nearly expired corporate credit card just to afford the short ride to a cheap, run-down motel near the interstate highway. Sitting quietly in the back of the dark vehicle, watching the glowing Seattle skyline blur past through the rain-streaked window, her frantic mind began to drastically shift gears. She was not just a weak, discarded wife who would fade into the background. She was a master architect of highly complex digital systems. She understood underlying logic, hidden infrastructure, and catastrophic vulnerabilities better than anyone. Mark had manipulated a simple legal loophole to temporarily destroy her life, but he was incredibly arrogant and remarkably careless with his digital footprint. As the flimsy motel room door finally locked behind her, she set her heavy suitcase down on the stained carpet and immediately opened her laptop on the small desk. The bright blue glow of the screen illuminated her fiercely determined face. She accessed a highly secure, heavily encrypted backup server she had secretly maintained and updated for years. Mark arrogantly thought he had completely outsmarted her by taking all the physical assets and the bank accounts, but he had entirely forgotten one crucial, fatal detail. Clara was the one who had built the entire digital, financial and client infrastructure for his lucrative consulting firm from the ground up. She pulled up the master access logs, her eyes rapidly scanning the raw streams of data flowing across the screen. She smiled faintly in the dark, silent room. He had stolen her foundation, so she was going to systematically and ruthlessly demolish his entire world. Clara bypassed the administrative firewall before the cheap motel coffee maker even finished brewing its bitter dark roast. The micro-hook of her revenge began with a simple line of execution code, entered into the black terminal window illuminating her face in the dim room. Mark was a smooth talker and a brilliant manipulator of human emotions, but he was an absolute novice when it came to cloud infrastructure. He had spent the last 5 years aggressively networking at high-end Seattle country clubs to build his boutique consulting firm, completely ignoring the fact that Clara had engineered every single piece of the digital architecture holding his lucrative enterprise together. Sitting on a sagging mattress with rain lashing against the thin window pane, she initiated the secure shell protocol and slipped unnoticed into his Amazon Web Services central environment as the undisputed root master. The sheer volume of raw data flowing across her laptop screen was intoxicating. She immediately accessed the master financial ledgers, her skilled eyes scanning the encrypted transaction logs with predatory focus. Mark believed he had perfectly hidden his assets by draining their joint Bank of America accounts into a private trust, but he had entirely failed to secure the primary operational accounts of his business. Clara pulled up the recent expense reports and felt a fresh, burning wave of absolute disgust wash over her. The financial violence he had committed was far worse than she had initially realized. He was not just stealing her salary. He was systematically siphoning money from his own corporate clients to fund his secret double life with Eleanor and the pregnant mistress. Line by line, the undeniable evidence of his massive corporate fraud materialized before her eyes. He had built a major Bellevue logistics corporation for thousands of hours of phantom consulting work, routing the fraudulent payments through a shell company registered in Delaware. Clara opened the secondary ledger and found the digital receipts for his recent personal purchases. There was a $30,000 transaction at Tiffany & Company for a diamond tennis bracelet, completed on the exact same day she had made the final massive payment on their home mortgage. There were invoices for a luxury imported SUV lease, premium prenatal care at a private clinic, and expensive European vacations, all categorized as deductible business expenses. He had built a lavish, fake kingdom on a foundation of pure financial crimes, using her hard-earned income as his personal safety net. The initial shock of the betrayal rapidly transformed into a cold, highly calculated strategy. Clara was not going to simply steal the money back or destroy the servers like a desperate, emotional victim. That would be criminal vandalism, and she refused to give Mark any opportunity to involve the local authorities and paint her as a hysterical, vengeful ex-wife. Instead, she was going to use his own aggressive legal tactics completely against him. When Clara originally built the corporate infrastructure, she had drafted a standard vendor contract naming herself as the sole independent security administrator. Mark, in his endless arrogance, had never bothered to officially terminate that specific contract. Under the strict letter of the corporate law, she was legally authorized to lock down the entire financial network if she detected any severe compliance violations or suspected data breaches. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with lethal precision as she initiated a comprehensive security lockdown. She systematically revoked every single one of Mark's administrative privileges, downgrading his access level from absolute owner to a restricted guest user. He could still log in and view his dashboard, but he could no longer authorize any outgoing wire transfers, access client data, or alter any system configurations. Clara then meticulously rewrote the payment gateway routing protocols. Any new incoming payments from his wealthy corporate clients would no longer deposit into his primary checking account. Instead, the funds would automatically redirect into a highly secure, legally compliant escrow account that only she controlled as the official system administrator. She was not stealing his money. She was legally quarantining it pending a full financial audit. As the digital sun began to rise over the servers, the actual sunrise painted the Seattle skyline in dull shades of gray and purple. Clara stretched her stiff neck, her eyes bloodshot but burning with a fierce, unstoppable energy. She had completely severed his digital spine without triggering a single alarm. Now, she just had to wait for the morning routines to commence. She poured herself a cup of the terrible motel coffee, wrapped her trench coat tightly around her shoulders, and placed her smartphone on the desk. She knew exactly what was going to happen next. Mark was a creature of incredibly predictable, expensive habits. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, her phone screen lit up with his contact name. Clara let it ring 4 times, letting the psychological pressure build, before calmly swiping the screen to accept the call. She did not say a single word, forcing him to speak first into the heavy, echoing silence. "Clara, fix the damn servers right now," Mark snapped, his voice tight with a mixture of immense irritation and underlying panic. "I am trying to pay the landscaping contractors for the new backyard renovations, and my corporate card was just declined at a coffee shop. Stop throwing a pathetic digital tantrum and restore my administrator access before I call the police." He was still clinging desperately to his false sense of superiority, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality of his situation. He thought she was just a discarded wife pulling a minor prank out of spite. "Your access has been permanently revoked due to severe compliance violations," Clara stated, her voice as cold and unyielding as a steel blade. "What the hell are you talking about?" Mark yelled, the ambient noise of a busy street echoing in the background. "I own the company. You have absolutely zero rights to touch my systems. You are already homeless, Clara. Do you want to go to federal prison too? Restore the access, or I swear I will have you arrested for corporate sabotage today." "I am the contracted security administrator, Mark," Clara replied smoothly, savoring the absolute power shift occurring in real time. "And I just found the fraudulent invoices you submitted to the Bellevue logistics firm, along with the undeclared offshore accounts you used to buy diamond bracelets for your mistress. I have legally quarantined all corporate assets pending a comprehensive audit. If you call the police, I will gladly hand the entire unencrypted ledger directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Fraud Division." A heavy, Suffocating silence fell over the phone line. The aggressive bluster instantly vanished from Mark's voice, replaced by the terrifying realization that he had just walked blindly into a devastating trap. He had stolen her physical house, but she had just locked the doors to his entire financial universe, and she held the only key. He tried to stammer out a threat, but his breath caught sharply in his throat. "This is not a negotiation," Clara finalized, her tone radiating pure dominance. "You are locked out. Enjoy the house, Mark. You are going to need a place to hide when your clients realize their money is gone." She ended the call without waiting for his pathetic response and immediately blocked his number. The power dynamic had completely inverted in less than 60 seconds. Clara turned back to her laptop to monitor the automated escrow transfers, feeling a dark sense of satisfaction as the first massive client payment bounced away from Mark's account. However, as she scanned the deepest layers of the restricted server architecture, she noticed a hidden, heavily encrypted folder completely separated from the main corporate database. It was labeled with the private name of a prominent state politician. Clara leaned closer to the glowing screen, her heartbeat accelerating. Mark was not just stealing money from logistics companies. He was hiding something incredibly dangerous, and she was about to blow his entire life wide open. The encrypted political folder cracked open, revealing a digital trail of illegal campaign contributions and massive extortion. Clara sat perfectly still in the dimly lit motel room, the harsh blue light of the monitor reflecting in her calculating eyes. She scanned the decrypted documents with a mixture of quiet horror and cold, undeniable fascination. Mark had not merely falsified routine corporate consulting invoices. He had been actively laundering massive amounts of untraceable cash for a highly influential Washington state senator. The secret ledger detailed exactly how Mark routed dirty political donations through his boutique consulting firm, taking a massive 30% cut for his absolute silence. He was essentially blackmailing a powerful, deeply corrupt politician to secretly fund his luxury lifestyle and his new secondary family. This was no longer just a messy suburban divorce involving a stolen residential property. This was a massive federal felony involving extremely dangerous, ruthless people. A sudden, violently aggressive pounding on the motel room door shattered her intense concentration. Clara immediately checked the external security feed through the cheap, high-definition camera she had discreetly mounted outside her window earlier that morning. It was not Mark. Standing on the exterior concrete walkway, completely soaked by the freezing Seattle rain, were Eleanor and the heavily pregnant Mistress. Mark, entirely terrified by the sudden financial lockdown and too utterly cowardly to face Clara himself, had sent his mother to aggressively intimidate her into surrendering the system passwords. Eleanor pounded her fists against the flimsy metal door again, loudly demanding that Clara open up and stop acting like a jealous, hysterical child. Clara smoothly closed her laptop, completely ignoring the loud, rhythmic banging, and calmly opened the door just wide enough to stand firmly in the frame. Eleanor immediately tried to forcefully push her way inside the small room, but Clara aggressively blocked the entrance with her shoulder, planting her feet securely. The older woman was vibrating with absolute rage, her expensive designer raincoat dripping freezing water onto the dirty concrete. The younger mistress stood slightly behind her, looking incredibly miserable and shivering violently in the cold wind, holding her stomach for maximum dramatic effect. Eleanor immediately launched into a vicious, high-volume verbal assault, screaming that Clara was a bitter thief who was actively trying to starve an innocent unborn child by freezing Mark's business bank accounts. She aggressively threatened to call the local Seattle news stations and publicly ruin Clara's prestigious professional reputation at her corporate software engineering firm. "You will restore my son's administrative access right now, or I will make sure you never work in this city again," Eleanor screamed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger directly at Clara's face. "You have absolutely no right to touch his hard-earned money just because you failed to be a proper wife." Clara did not flinch, her expression remaining entirely composed and dangerously calm. She looked past Eleanor, staring directly into the wide, panicked eyes of the shivering pregnant woman. The younger woman looked deeply uncomfortable, clearly realizing that the luxurious, wealthy life Mark had aggressively promised her was suddenly collapsing into chaos. Clara knew that Eleanor was just a loud, desperate pawn in a much larger, deadlier game. The true power in this dynamic had completely and irreversibly shifted. Clara reached into her wool coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and activated a heavy, undeniably controversial strategy. She was not going to stand in the rain and argue with a bitter, manipulative old woman. She was going to completely destroy their false sense of ultimate security. "I did not steal his money, Eleanor," Clara stated, her voice echoing coldly in the damp morning air. "I legally quarantined it pending a federal audit, but you should probably check the morning news instead of standing outside my door. Mark is going to need a very expensive criminal defense attorney by noon." Clara slammed the heavy metal door shut, engaging the brass deadbolt and completely ignoring the renewed, frantic screaming from the other side. She walked briskly back to her desk, her brilliant mind operating with cold, brutal efficiency. She had meticulously extracted a specific, highly damaging subset of the political money laundering documents. Instead of handing the undeniable evidence directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which would take several months to build a proper legal case, she made a ruthless, highly controversial choice. She compiled the most explosive financial logs and anonymously emailed the entire encrypted packet directly to a vicious, well-funded rival political action committee located in Olympia. She deliberately bypassed the proper legal justice system, opting instead to throw Mark directly into a vicious, unforgiving political meat grinder. This calculated decision crossed a massive moral boundary. She was intentionally exposing Mark to the unhinged wrath of powerful, extremely dangerous political operatives who operated entirely far outside the established bounds of traditional law. She fully knew these shadowy figures would not simply file a civil lawsuit. They would actively destroy anyone threatening their lucrative political empire. Clara watched the encrypted email transmission complete with a definitive, glowing green checkmark. She had effectively painted a massive, glowing target directly on Mark's back. He had arrogantly wanted to play ruthless games with her life, so she had just invited the most dangerous, lethal predators in the entire state to join the playing field. Within exactly 45 minutes, the massive, terrifying consequences of her anonymous digital leak began to manifest rapidly. Clara intently monitored the primary corporate server logs and noticed a massive, highly sophisticated spike in hostile external traffic. Someone with incredibly serious financial resources was violently attempting to brute force their way into Mark's primary consulting servers. It was definitely not standard law enforcement. It was a private, highly aggressive cybersecurity firm trying to desperately scrub the incriminating evidence before it went public. Mark's carefully constructed digital world was burning down rapidly around him. He had completely lost control of his stolen money, and now his most dangerous, illegal secret had just been fully weaponized against him. Her cheap prepaid burner phone, sitting quietly next to her high-end laptop, suddenly illuminated with an incoming call from an unknown, heavily encrypted international number. This was definitely not Mark, and it certainly was not Eleanor throwing another tantrum. Clara stared at the glowing digital screen, the steady, rhythmic sound of the rain hitting the thin windows suddenly sounding exactly like a ticking time bomb. The furious political operatives had already successfully traced the origin of the server lockdown, and they were actively reaching out to the sole surviving system administrator. She slowly reached out her hand to answer the ringing call, fully realizing she had just crossed the absolute point of no return. The encrypted call connected with a sharp, metallic click, instantly dropping Clara into a dangerous, high-stakes negotiation. She pressed the cheap plastic burner phone against her ear, listening to the heavy, artificially modulated breathing on the other end of the secure digital line. The voice that finally spoke was cold, perfectly enunciated, and entirely devoid of any recognizable human empathy. The mysterious caller did not bother introducing himself, immediately demanding absolute, unhindered root access to Mark's primary consulting servers and the immediate, permanent destruction of all decrypted financial ledgers. He casually mentioned her exact motel room number and the specific license plate of the ride-sharing vehicle she had arrived in, a blatant, terrifying intimidation tactic designed to completely break her psychological resolve and force a rapid surrender. Clara did not panic, her highly trained mind operating with the exact same flawless, unemotional logic she applied to complex software architecture. She leaned back in the cheap, uncomfortable wooden chair, staring blankly out the rain-streaked window at the gray, depressing Seattle skyline. She calmly and methodically explained that she had already configured a highly secure, automated dead man switch hidden deep within an untraceable offshore server farm located in Switzerland. If she failed to manually enter a specific, highly randomized alphanumeric passcode every 12 hours, The entire unredacted cache of political money laundering documents would automatically broadcast directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and every major national news syndicate simultaneously. You cannot intimidate me with physical violence, because my continued safety is your only guarantee of absolute political silence, Clara stated. Her voice remarkably steady and dripping with undeniable authority. Mark is a careless, arrogant liability who recklessly stole your operational money to fund his personal suburban fantasy. I am the only reason your entire political empire is not currently imploding on national television. A long, heavily calculating silence stretched across the encrypted digital connection. The dangerous political operative on the other end quickly realized he was not dealing with a hysterical, discarded housewife crying over a broken marriage, but rather a brilliant, emotionally detached systems engineer holding a massive digital thermal detonator. The artificially modulated voice instantly dropped its aggressive, threatening posture, adopting a much more professional and transactional tone. He asked her exactly what she wanted in exchange for the permanent deletion of the heavily encrypted political files and the immediate restoration of their private, illegal financial routing networks. This was the precise moment Clara crossed a massive, terrifying moral boundary, firmly cementing her path of absolute vengeance. She did not ask for a massive financial payout, a newly forged identity, or official police protection. Instead, she offered the dangerous syndicate a highly specific, devastatingly cruel target. She explained that Mark had aggressively utilized their stolen political funds to quietly pay off the massive remaining mortgage on his luxurious King County residence. By officially routing the dirty campaign money through a hidden Delaware shell corporation, the physical property was technically and legally vulnerable to immediate, aggressive asset seizure by the Political Action Committee's ruthless private security contractors. She was essentially weaponizing a dangerous, untraceable criminal syndicate to violently evict her ex-husband, his cruel mother, and his pregnant mistress. I will transmit the server encryption keys immediately after you physically reclaim your stolen assets, Clara finalized, her tone radiating pure, icy vengeance. I want him permanently removed from that property by sunset today, and I want all of his personal electronics confiscated. If he retains even a single hard drive or mobile device, he will inevitably attempt to leverage the remaining data against both of us. The operative agreed to the brutal, unforgiving terms without a single moment of hesitation, instantly terminating the call and leaving Clara in the quiet, damp motel room. She immediately opened her high-end laptop and bypassed the primary security protocols for her former home's highly intelligent camera network. Mark had arrogantly changed the standard wireless network passwords, but he had entirely forgotten that Clara had personally written the foundational firmware for the entire property management system. She opened a comprehensive grid of high-definition video feeds on her screen, giving her a perfect, unobstructed digital view of the front driveway, the grand foyer, and the lavishly decorated living room she had personally designed and funded. She watched the silent, high-definition drama slowly unfold over the next 2 tense hours with a cold, metallic sense of absolute satisfaction. The heavy, freezing Seattle rain continued to fall relentlessly as 3 massive, heavily tinted Chevrolet Suburbans abruptly pulled into the wide circular driveway, aggressively blocking Mark's expensive imported luxury vehicle. Over a dozen massive men wearing dark, tailored suits and carrying heavy tactical equipment stepped out into the freezing downpour. They were definitely not local law enforcement officers carrying official, court-ordered warrants. They were highly paid, ruthless corporate fixers operating entirely outside the strict boundaries of the traditional legal justice system. Mark opened the heavy oak front door, his face rapidly twisting from a look of arrogant annoyance into an expression of absolute sheer terror as the massive men forcefully pushed past him into the pristine foyer. Clara watched through the digital lens as the lead contractor shoved a thick, legally binding corporate seizure document aggressively into Mark's chest. The heavily armed men did not bother politely negotiating or explaining the situation. They immediately began systematically dismantling his entire carefully constructed life, aggressively ripping expensive computer monitors off the walls and forcefully confiscating every single laptop, tablet, and smart device in the residence to ensure absolutely no digital copies of the political ledger survived. Eleanor and the pregnant mistress rushed into the main hallway, their faces pale with sudden, overwhelming shock and confusion. Eleanor attempted to aggressively scream at the intrusive men, pointing her perfectly manicured fingers and loudly threatening to call the local authorities to arrest them for trespassing. One of the massive, intimidating security contractors simply turned and stared at her with such terrifying, dead-eyed menace that the older woman instantly collapsed into a terrified, whimpering silence, desperately clutching the wooden staircase railing for physical support. The young mistress began crying hysterically, frantically grabbing her expensive designer handbags and desperately rushing toward the back door, fully realizing that the wealthy, secure fantasy world she had stolen was violently collapsing around her. Clara watched Mark fall entirely to his knees on the expensive hardwood floor, his shaking hands desperately clutching his head as the ruthless contractors aggressively shoved him toward the open front door. They were throwing him out into the exact same freezing rain he had arrogantly forced Clara into just 24 hours earlier. He was losing absolutely everything simultaneously: his stolen political money, his fake corporate reputation, and now, his stolen residential sanctuary. The ultimate power shift was beautifully, symmetrically flawless, executing exactly as she had engineered it. However, as Clara watched the black tactical vehicles finally speed away from the empty house, her secondary burner phone suddenly illuminated with a startling new notification. It was an urgent, highly secure text message from a verified insider contact she maintained at the Seattle Police Department. Mark, backed into an incredibly desperate, terrifying corner by the violent political syndicate, had just officially filed a massive federal criminal complaint against Clara. He was aggressively framing her for high-level corporate cyber-terrorism, and a heavily armed tactical response team was currently mobilizing to raid her cheap roadside motel. The distant, wailing shriek of approaching police sirens pierced the freezing rain as Clara initiated a catastrophic system wipe. Her high-end laptop screen flashed a vibrant, blinding crimson warning as the military-grade encryption software began systematically burning every single piece of residual data to absolute digital ash. She did not have the luxury of panic or hesitation. Mark had aggressively leveraged the federal justice system against her, falsely reporting her for a massive corporate cyber attack to cover up his own devastating financial losses. Clara calmly unplugged the encrypted master flash drive, slipped it securely into the waterproof inner pocket of her heavy wool trench coat, and aggressively smashed her laptop screen with the heavy base of the cheap motel desk lamp. She tossed the ruined, smoking hardware directly into the overflowing bathtub, completely destroying the internal motherboard and severing the last physical tie to her location. The flashing red and blue tactical lights began aggressively stroking the thin motel curtains. Clara moved with the cold, absolute precision of a seasoned combat veteran. Before violently destroying the computer, she had executed one final, beautifully malicious routing script. When Mark frantically submitted the fake digital evidence to the Seattle Cybercrimes Division, he carelessly used the exact same corrupted administrative portal he used for his political money laundering. Clara had instantly intercepted the police department's incoming data ping and aggressively mirrored the originating internet protocol address. Instead of tracing the fake terrorism threat to her cheap motel room, the federal trace would automatically bounce through a massive proxy network and land directly on Mark's newly purchased prepaid mobile device. He had arrogantly handed the federal authorities a direct, perfectly illuminated map to his own illegal Delaware shell corporations. Heavy, militarized tactical boots slammed violently against the exterior concrete walkway just as Clara quietly unlocked the small, frosted bathroom window. She slipped gracefully out into the freezing, muddy alleyway exactly 3 seconds before a massive steel battering ram completely shattered the flimsy front door. Clara pressed her back against the damp brick wall of the adjacent building, pulling the heavy coat collar up against the biting wind. She watched from the deep shadows as a dozen heavily armed tactical officers aggressively stormed the tiny, empty room, their blinding tactical flashlights cutting through the humid air. They found absolutely nothing but a shattered, useless laptop and the lingering smell of burnt silicon. Clara turned and walked calmly down the dark alley, disappearing completely into the sprawling, unforgiving Seattle night. 10 blocks away, sitting in a harsh, fluorescently lit 24-hour roadside diner, Clara ordered a black coffee and opened a secondary, ultra-compact tablet she kept hidden for extreme emergencies. She connected to the diner's unsecured public wireless network, instantly cloaking her digital footprint through 3 separate international virtual private networks. She activated a specialized audio surveillance program designed to aggressively track the exact radio frequency of Mark's new prepaid mobile phone. He and Eleanor were currently huddled in a miserable, freezing bus shelter on the outskirts of King County, completely soaked and desperately trying to formulate a survival plan. Clara plugged in a single black earbud, listening intently as Mark arrogantly dialed the Seattle police precinct, fully expecting to hear that his ex-wife was currently sitting in a cold interrogation room. "I am the owner of the consulting firm who reported the cyber attack," Mark stated into the phone, his voice shaking with a pathetic mixture of cold and forced authority. "I need an immediate update on the arrest of my former employee." Clara took a slow, deliberate sip of her bitter coffee, savoring the impending devastation. The police detective on the other end of the line did not offer comforting words or confirm a successful tactical raid. Instead, the officer's voice was violently aggressive and deeply suspicious. The detective bluntly informed Mark that the digital evidence he provided contained massive, unencrypted transaction logs linking his personal identity directly to multiple fraudulent offshore accounts. The detective aggressively ordered Mark to surrender himself to the downtown precinct for immediate questioning regarding massive federal wire fraud and illegal campaign contributions, explicitly warning him that attempting to flee the state would result in a massive federal manhunt. Mark dropped the cheap plastic phone onto the wet concrete floor of the bus shelter, his entire body convulsing with sheer, absolute panic. Clara listened to his heavy, terrified breathing through the digital audio intercept. He turned to his mother, his voice cracking violently as he confessed that the police were not hunting Clara, they were actively hunting him. The ultimate, devastating realization washed over Eleanor like a bucket of freezing water. The powerful, arrogant son she had constantly praised and protected was now a massive federal liability, entirely ruined by his own catastrophic hubris and greed. The pregnant mistress, sitting miserably on the cold metal bench, began sobbing uncontrollably, demanding to know how she was supposed to afford her expensive prenatal medical treatments. Eleanor grabbed Mark by the shoulders, her sharp voice cutting through the heavy rain. She aggressively told him to stop crying like a pathetic child. She confidently revealed that she still maintained a massive, entirely hidden retirement pension fund, safely managed by an exclusive private wealth firm completely independent from Mark's ruined consulting business. She promised to liquidate the entire account the moment the banks opened, assuring Mark they could easily afford the most aggressive, ruthless criminal defense attorney in the entire state of Washington to destroy Clara in federal court. Sitting in the warm diner, Clara smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. She typed the name of Eleanor's exclusive private wealth management firm into her secure terminal window. The devastating truth populated on her screen in less than 5 seconds. The corrupt investment firm Eleanor trusted with her entire life savings was the exact same shady financial institution Mark had used to launder the dirty political money. And because Clara still maintained absolute root access to the entire corrupted financial network, Eleanor's massive retirement fund was just sitting there, completely exposed and entirely unprotected. Clara cracked her knuckles, preparing to absolutely annihilate the cruel mother-in-law's entire financial future. Clara bypassed the secondary biometric firewall of the exclusive wealth management firm before her bitter black coffee even grew cold. The microhook of her ultimate financial strike was remarkably simple, relying entirely on the catastrophic arrogance of her enemies. Sitting in the brightly lit corner booth of the 24-hour roadside diner, with the freezing Seattle rain aggressively battering the thick glass windows, she navigated the highly encrypted administrator dashboard of the elite investment portfolio. Eleanor had spent her entire adult life aggressively hoarding a massive, $2 million retirement fund, constantly boasting about her superior financial literacy and traditional conservative values. However, Eleanor was completely oblivious to the crucial fact that her exclusive wealth manager was utilizing the exact same vulnerable digital infrastructure that Mark used to launder his illegal campaign contributions. Instead of illegally transferring the massive sum of money into her own offshore accounts, Clara opted for a much more devastating and entirely legal method of absolute destruction. She accessed the federal compliance portal perfectly integrated within the primary banking architecture. With a few rapid, incredibly precise keystrokes, she aggressively linked the specific routing numbers of Eleanor's pristine retirement account directly to Mark's highly toxic, federally flagged Delaware shell corporations. She meticulously generated an automated, high-priority suspicious activity report, heavily detailing a fictitious but flawlessly documented pattern of illegal political money laundering flowing directly through the mother's personal savings. Clara then routed the explosive compliance file directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and the United States Department of the Treasury. The trap snapped shut with a silent, invisible digital click. By intentionally flagging the massive account for severe federal terrorism and money laundering violations, Clara instantly triggered a mandatory, irreversible asset freeze under the strict guidelines of federal banking laws. The massive retirement fund was not simply emptied. It was entirely locked down under federal jurisdiction, utterly inaccessible to anyone without a massive, multi-year federal court battle. Eleanor possessed $2 million on paper, but in actual reality she could not legally purchase a single cup of cheap diner coffee. Clara leaned back against the red vinyl booth, her eyes cold and highly calculating, watching the dull gray sun rise over the Pacific Northwest. She had completely neutralized their very last financial lifeline, and she knew exactly where they would desperately run next. Exactly 3 hours later, the heavy glass doors of a prestigious private banking branch in downtown Seattle swung open. Eleanor marched aggressively into the luxurious marble lobby, completely ignoring her damp, wrinkled designer clothing and her absolutely exhausted physical demeanor. Mark followed closely behind her, looking entirely broken and terrified, constantly looking over his shoulder for approaching federal agents. The young pregnant mistress trailed behind them both, shivering violently in her ruined expensive coat, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent room. Eleanor slammed her platinum identification card onto the polished mahogany desk of the senior branch manager, aggressively demanding an immediate, total liquidation of her entire financial portfolio in the form of untraceable cashier checks. The senior branch manager, a sharply dressed corporate executive who had respectfully accommodated Eleanor for nearly a decade, carefully typed her account details into his secure terminal. Clara watched the silent, fascinating drama unfold through a compromised internal security camera feed she had quietly accessed from the diner booth. The manager's polite, highly trained customer service smile instantly vanished, rapidly replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated professional horror. The severe federal hold notice flashed aggressively across his monitor in bright red warning text. He slowly pushed his heavy leather chair back, his hands raised defensively in the air, and quietly informed Eleanor that he absolutely could not authorize the massive withdrawal. He nervously explained that her entire financial portfolio was currently under a severe, active lockdown by the federal government pending a massive criminal investigation into illegal political syndicates. Eleanor instantly erupted into a violently aggressive, uncontrollable screaming tantrum right in the middle of the quiet, sophisticated banking lobby. She violently slammed her fists against the polished mahogany desk, knocking over a heavy crystal pen holder and loudly threatening to sue the entire banking institution for gross incompetence and illegal theft. She screamed that she was a highly respected member of the local high society, completely refusing to accept the catastrophic reality that her entire life savings had just evaporated into a highly secure federal evidence locker. Mark grabbed her arm, trying desperately to pull her away before the bank's armed security guards aggressively intervened, but Eleanor viciously slapped his hand away. In a moment of pure, blinding desperation, she pulled out her waterlogged smartphone and aggressively dialed Clara's burner number. Clara accepted the call on the first ring, listening quietly to the chaotic, echoing sounds of the prestigious bank lobby and the heavy, terrified breathing of her former mother-in-law. "You malicious, disgusting thief. You unlock my retirement accounts right this second before I have you thrown in a federal penitentiary for the rest of your miserable life." Eleanor shrieked into the phone, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of high-class dignity. "That money belongs to me, and you have absolutely no right to touch my future." "I did not touch your money, Eleanor. I simply introduced it to the United States Treasury Department," Clara replied, her voice an incredibly smooth, freezing whisper that cut entirely through the frantic screaming. "You aggressively funded and protected a federal criminal, and now you are officially registered as his primary financial accomplice. Enjoy the total collapse of your precious legacy." Clara decisively terminated the connection, completely severing the communication line forever. Back in the bank lobby, the ultimate, devastating novelty of the morning finally occurred. The young pregnant mistress, finally understanding the absolute, irreversible finality of the situation, made a remarkably cold and highly calculated decision. While Mark and Eleanor were aggressively arguing with the approaching security guards, she quietly reached into Mark's damp coat pocket. She silently extracted the heavy keys to his expensive luxury rental vehicle and his last remaining emergency credit card. Without saying a single word or shedding a single tear, she turned and briskly walked out the heavy glass doors into the bustling Seattle street, completely abandoning them to the federal authorities. Mark turned around, wildly searching the massive lobby for his new, supposedly perfect family, only to realize that the mistress had completely vanished with his very last viable escape route. He was entirely stranded in downtown Seattle with absolutely no money, no home, no transportation, and a massive federal arrest warrant hanging aggressively over his head. He slowly turned to look at his mother, his eyes wide with absolute, primal panic. Eleanor simply stared blankly at the cold marble floor, her expensive platinum bank card completely useless in her trembling hands. But Clara was not entirely finished. She still had one final, devastating piece of physical evidence to deliver to the violent political syndicate, and it was going to ensure Mark never saw the outside of a federal courtroom again for the next 3 decades. The final piece of physical evidence was not a printed document, but Mark's exact geographical coordinates. Clara watched the blinking red dot on her encrypted tablet screen with absolute, predatory focus. Mark and Eleanor had stumbled out of the luxurious private bank and were currently wandering blindly through the congested, rain-soaked streets of downtown Seattle. They were completely destitute, desperately trying to flag down a city taxi with absolutely no viable method of payment. Clara knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation was actively mobilizing a heavily armed task force to apprehend him for massive wire fraud. But a sterile federal prison cell was far too merciful for a man who had intentionally tried to destroy her entire existence. She wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating, inescapable terror she had felt when he forcefully threw her out into the freezing storm just 24 hours prior. Clara reopened the highly secure, encrypted communication channel to the ruthless political operative representing the Olympia Syndicate. She did not bother with formal pleasantries or unnecessary introductions, immediately stating that she possessed the precise, real-time geographical location of the rogue consultant who had recklessly stolen their massive campaign funds. The artificially modulated voice on the other end of the line hissed with a dark, violent anticipation, aggressively demanding the physical address. Clara laid out her final, uncompromising terms. She promised to deliver Mark directly into their violent hands, perfectly isolating him from the protective custody of local law enforcement. But in exchange, the dangerous syndicate had to permanently erase Clara's biometric data and administrative signatures from every single corrupted server they controlled. She was demanding a completely clean slate, effectively erasing her entire digital existence from the massive criminal conspiracy and leaving Mark to bear the crushing, devastating weight of the brutal fallout alone. Send the exact coordinates immediately, and your digital existence will be permanently scrubbed from our private networks before the hour concludes, the operative agreed, his tone radiating a terrifying, lethal efficiency. We have a highly specialized extraction team currently operating exactly 4 blocks away from the financial district. He will not reach a police station alive. Clara seamlessly transmitted the live tracking link, effectively signing Mark's ultimate physical doom. She then engaged the most brilliant, highly controversial novelty of her entire digital revenge operation. Mark was currently cowering under a massive digitally integrated public transit shelter on a busy Seattle intersection, desperately trying to shield his exhausted, weeping mother from the freezing downpour. Clara accessed the municipal smart city infrastructure grid, an extensive network she had ironically helped optimize during a massive corporate software contract 3 years prior. With a series of rapid, devastating keystrokes, she aggressively hijacked the massive digital advertising displayed directly above Mark's head. The bright, colorful commercial advertisement for a local coffee franchise abruptly vanished, instantly replaced by a stark, glowing black and white screen. Clara deliberately projected the unredacted, highly illegal financial ledgers directly onto the massive public billboard. The explosive document explicitly detailed Mark's full name, his home address, and the massive millions of dollars he had illegally laundered for corrupt politicians. Pedestrians waiting for the city bus began pointing and staring in absolute shock at the massive screen, pulling out their smartphones to record the unbelievable public confession. Mark looked up, his face completely draining of all human color as he realized his deepest, darkest criminal secrets were currently being broadcast to the entire city of Seattle. His sheer, primal panic peaked as Clara simultaneously hijacked the public transit audio speakers mounted inside the thick glass shelter. The automated, pleasant voice announcing the incoming bus schedules was brutally overridden by a cold, metallic text-to-speech synthesizer Clara had quickly programmed on her tablet. The federal authorities are exactly 3 minutes away. Mark, the robotic, amplified voice echoed loudly through the crowded bus stop, causing everyone to turn and stare directly at the terrified, soaking wet man. But the private security contractors you stole millions of dollars from are only 60 seconds away. You are completely out of time, Eleanor screamed, finally comprehending the sheer, terrifying magnitude of her son's catastrophic failures. She desperately tried to push herself physically away from him, suddenly terrified of being physically associated with a marked, heavily targeted man. Mark spun around wildly, his eyes darting frantically across the congested intersection. He saw the flashing red and blue lights of the approaching Seattle police cruisers struggling to push through the heavy downtown traffic exactly 3 blocks down the avenue. He actually felt a massive wave of perverse, desperate relief. A federal prison sentence, even a brutal one, was infinitely preferable to whatever the ruthless political syndicate had planned for him in a dark, soundproof warehouse. He stepped out from the bus shelter, frantically waving his arms and desperately running toward the approaching police sirens, actively begging to be arrested. However, Clara was the absolute master of the digital board, and she completely refused to let him choose his own punishment. She aggressively hacked into the municipal traffic control grid, instantly forcing every single automated stoplight in the massive intersection to glow a solid, unyielding red. The heavy downtown traffic violently ground to an absolute halt, completely barricading the approaching police cruisers behind a massive wall of honking, frustrated civilian vehicles. Mark watched in sheer horror as the police sirens wailed uselessly, entirely trapped exactly 2 blocks away by a manufactured traffic jam. From the opposite direction, completely unimpeded by the gridlock traffic, 2 massive, heavily tinted black Chevrolet Suburbans aggressively jumped the concrete curb. They screeched to a violent halt directly in front of the public transit shelter, blocking Mark's only physical escape route. 4 massive men wearing dark tactical gear stepped out into the pouring rain. They did not wear badges, and they did not read Mark his legal rights. They simply grabbed him by the expensive lapels of his ruined designer coat, effortlessly lifting him off the wet pavement. Mark screamed for his mother, thrashing wildly, but Eleanor simply stood frozen against the glass shelter, pressing her hands against her mouth in absolute, paralyzing terror as she watched her golden child violently dragged into the dark vehicle. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, and the black sport utility vehicles merged seamlessly back into the chaotic Seattle traffic, disappearing completely before the trapped police cruisers could even clear the crowded intersection. Clara closed the municipal traffic terminal on her tablet, the harsh, bright screen reflecting in her calm, completely unbothered eyes. She took another slow, deliberate sip of her diner coffee, listening to the rain tap against the window. The game was effectively over, and she had won absolutely everything. The heavy brass key turned smoothly in the deadbolt, echoing like a triumphant gunshot through the empty foyer. Clara stepped over the threshold of the massive King County estate, pulling her wool coat tightly against the lingering chill of the damp Washington morning. The luxurious residence was entirely devoid of its former arrogant warmth, stripped bare by the ruthless efficiency of the private security contractors and the subsequent federal evidence teams. The expensive custom artwork had been violently ripped from the pristine walls, leaving massive, jagged holes in the expensive drywall. The beautiful granite kitchen counters were covered in a thick layer of gray fingerprint dusting powder left behind by the aggressive cybercrimes division. It looked exactly like the aftermath of a devastating war, which was flawlessly appropriate, considering Clara had just single-handedly completely annihilated the enemy. She did not break into the property, nor was she trespassing on a federal crime scene. She was standing in the center of the living room as the sole, uncontested legal owner. The brilliant novelty of her final financial maneuver had occurred exactly 48 hours after Mark was violently abducted by the political syndicate. When the federal authorities officially seized the Delaware Shell Corporation to recover the stolen campaign funds, the heavily mortgaged physical property was instantly placed into an expedited government liquidation auction. Using her massive, entirely legitimate corporate bonuses that Mark had never managed to discover, Clara established a secure, anonymous limited liability company. She purchased her own custom-built dream house back directly from the United States Marshals Service for absolute pennies on the dollar, legally washing the property entirely clean of Mark's toxic criminal history. Clara slowly walked up the sweeping oak staircase, her leather boots echoing sharply against the bare wood. She surveyed the massive master bedroom, stepping carefully over the discarded, ruined designer clothing left behind by the panicked pregnant mistress. The expensive mattress was completely overturned, aggressively slashed open by the federal agents desperately searching for hidden flash drives or illicit cash reserves. Clara felt absolutely no residual emotional attachment to the ruined furniture or the violated space. She was a master software architect, and she fundamentally understood that occasionally, you had to completely demolish a corrupted foundational structure before you could begin writing clean, functional code. She was already mentally calculating the extensive renovation costs to entirely erase any physical memory of her treacherous ex-husband. As she turned down the long hallway toward Mark's former home office, a sudden, pathetic shuffling noise broke the heavy, suffocating silence of the empty house. Clara completely froze, her highly analytical mind instantly mapping the possible threats. The primary electrical grid had been officially disconnected by the municipal utility company following the massive federal asset freeze. She moved silently toward the heavy oak door of the guest bedroom, pushing it open with absolute, calculating caution. Sitting on the bare hardwood floor, aggressively wrapped in a filthy, damp cashmere blanket, was Eleanor. The once proud, arrogantly wealthy matriarch looked entirely unrecognizable, her expensive silver hair heavily matted and her designer clothing stained with mud and dried rain. Eleanor had successfully evaded the initial federal sweep of the property by desperately hiding inside a cramped, dusty ventilation crawlspace above the garage. With her massive retirement portfolio entirely frozen by the Treasury Department and her beloved son vanishing completely off the face of the earth, she had absolutely nowhere else to go. She had spent the last 3 days squatting in the freezing, dark house like a terrified, discarded rodent, drinking stagnant water from the melting ice in the disconnected refrigerator. When Eleanor looked up and saw Clara standing flawlessly composed in the doorway, a sudden, desperate spark of her old, venomous arrogance briefly flickered in her exhausted, sunken eyes. Eleanor desperately tried to stand up, clutching the dirty blanket tightly around her shivering shoulders, but her legs were entirely too weak from prolonged exposure and starvation. She loudly demanded to know what Clara was doing in her son's house, aggressively threatening to call the local police and have her officially arrested for breaking and entering. She was completely trapped in a severe psychological delusion, desperately refusing to accept the catastrophic reality that her powerful, wealthy family had been utterly and completely destroyed. Clara did not raise her voice, nor did she offer a single ounce of human pity. She simply reached into her leather tote bag and pulled out the crisp, legally notarized federal auction deed. Mark does not own this property anymore, and neither does the federal government, Clara stated, her voice echoing with the cold, absolute finality of a steel trap snapping shut. I purchased the entire estate through a private corporate entity yesterday morning. You are currently trespassing on my private property, Eleanor, and I am not feeling particularly generous today. The heavy, official document fluttered to the floor, landing at Eleanor's muddy feet. The older woman stared at the bold legal signatures, her body shaking uncontrollably as the final wave of absolute reality finally broke over her. The massive house she had arrogantly helped steal was now the instrument of her ultimate eviction. She collapsed back onto the cold floor, entirely abandoning her false pride, and began violently sobbing. She desperately begged Clara for basic mercy, pleading for just 1 week to sleep in the guest room, promising to clean the ruined floors and act as an obedient servant if Clara would just let her stay out of the freezing rain. Clara stared down at the pathetic, broken woman who had spent an entire decade aggressively attempting to destroy her career and her confidence. There was absolutely no lingering anger left in Clara's chest, only a profound, freezing apathy. She reached into her bag again, pulled out a heavy black plastic trash bag, and dropped it completely unceremoniously onto the floor next to the weeping woman. Clara did not bother engaging in a drawn-out, emotional argument. She simply issued a cold, non-negotiable directive, completely stripping Eleanor of any remaining dignity or leverage. She was officially taking out the garbage. You have exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever ruined clothing you can carry and exit my house, Clara finalized, turning her back on the sobbing woman and walking briskly down the hallway. If you are still inside this building when my private security contractors arrive to change the exterior locks, they will physically throw you onto the public sidewalk. Clara pulled out her phone to dial the locksmith, feeling a profound sense of closure when she suddenly noticed a small, heavily concealed metallic wall safe hidden behind a shattered piece of drywall in Mark's office. The federal agents had completely missed it, and the blinking green digital light indicated it was still actively drawing power from a hidden, independent battery backup. The blinking green indicator light of the heavily concealed metallic wall safe demanded her immediate, highly analytical attention. The federal agents had violently torn the expensive drywall apart during their massive raid, but they had completely missed the reinforced steel compartment securely embedded behind the primary structural beam. Clara kneeled onto the dusty hardwood floor of Mark's ruined home office, staring intensely at the sophisticated biometric keypad. She did not possess Mark's physical fingerprint, but she possessed something infinitely more powerful and effective. She was the original master architect of his entire digital life. Mark was an arrogant consumer of high-end technology, completely oblivious to the underlying foundational code. Clara retrieved a specialized, braided data cable from her leather tote bag and connected her encrypted tablet directly to the safe's hidden diagnostic port. She rapidly executed a brutal, highly sophisticated brute force decryption script she had personally coded during her demanding years at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. The bright tablet screen scrolled through thousands of encrypted alphanumeric combinations in mere seconds. A heavy, satisfying mechanical click echoed loudly through the silent, empty house as the thick steel door slowly popped open, revealing the dark, highly protected interior cavity. Clara reached inside the cold steel box, completely expecting to find bundles of hidden emergency cash or falsified corporate property deeds. Instead, her fingers brushed against a sleek, heavy titanium cold storage cryptocurrency wallet and a small, luxurious black velvet pouch. She slowly opened the soft pouch, carefully spilling over a dozen massive, flawless, completely unregistered diamonds directly onto her dusty palm. These were definitely high-grade conflict stones, incredibly valuable and completely untraceable on the legitimate international market. Beneath the glittering stones lay a small, unremarkable leather-bound notebook. Clara opened the thin pages, her eyes rapidly scanning the meticulous, handwritten ink. It was Mark's ultimate, highly dangerous insurance policy against the violent political syndicate he had been illegally serving for the past 4 years. He had not just quietly laundered dirty campaign money, he had aggressively recorded their most depraved, highly illegal activities. The physical ledger contained incredibly detailed timestamps, specific geographical coordinates, and the actual names of deeply compromised federal judges, state senators, and powerful corporate executives across the entire Pacific Northwest. It was a massive, highly radioactive weapon capable of destroying an entire shadow government. A morally upright, law-abiding citizen would have immediately surrendered this explosive physical evidence and the massive illegal fortune directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But Clara had absorbed an incredibly brutal, unforgiving lesson about power dynamics over the last several agonizing days. The traditional legal system had completely failed her, almost allowing her treacherous husband to leave her entirely homeless and destitute. She made a remarkably dark, incredibly controversial decision right there on the dusty floor. She was keeping the untraceable diamonds, the decentralized cryptocurrency, and the explosive blackmail ledger entirely for herself. She connected the heavy titanium hardware wallet to her secure tablet, bypassing the secondary security pin with her decryption software. The digital display illuminated, revealing a staggering, unbelievable financial balance. Mark had secretly amassed nearly $8 million in decentralized, untraceable digital currency. He had been aggressively skimming massive amounts off the top of his elite money laundering operations for years, completely hiding his massive shadow wealth from everyone, including his arrogant mother and his demanding pregnant mistress. Clara initiated a highly complex, automated series of digital currency transfers. She rapidly tumbled the massive digital fortune through dozens of international, decentralized crypto exchanges, effectively washing the digital tokens completely clean. She finally deposited the massive, newly laundered fortune directly into her own highly secure, absolutely anonymous digital vaults. She was not merely reclaiming her stolen corporate bonuses anymore. She was actively absorbing Mark's entire illicit financial empire to heavily fund her own independent future. Her encrypted burner phone suddenly vibrated against the wooden floorboards, displaying a highly secure text message from the Olympia political operative. It contained a single digital photograph. The high-definition image showed Mark, completely stripped of his expensive designer clothing, sitting terrified in a dark, concrete basement. He was securely chained to a heavy industrial steel pipe, his eyes wide with absolute, primal horror. The operative's accompanying text message coldly confirmed that Mark would never see the natural sunlight again, completely satisfying her ruthless demand for absolute, permanent vengeance. However, the dangerous fixer asked one final, incredibly threatening question. He aggressively demanded to know if Clara had located Mark's physical insurance ledger during her complete takeover of the massive residential property. If she admitted she possessed the explosive notebook, the syndicate would relentlessly hunt her down with lethal military force. If she entirely denied its existence, they might aggressively send their own heavily armed tactical sweepers to violently tear the beautiful house apart. Clara typed her response with cold, absolute, terrifying dominance, completely shifting the ultimate power dynamic in a single, devastating move. She explicitly stated she had completely burned the physical notebook in her fireplace, but she casually and perfectly recited the exact names of 3 highly compromised federal judges listed on the first page. She vaguely hinted that her encrypted deadman switch was still actively monitoring their political network. She was explicitly telling the dangerous syndicate that she now held their absolute leash. "Do not ever approach this property again," Clara typed, her fingers moving with lethal precision. "If I see a dark vehicle on my street, your entire political shadow government burns to the ground." The oppressive, heavy silence of the encrypted digital channel stretched for a long, highly tense minute. She was playing a massive game of psychological chess with actual murderers, entirely relying on her cold, calculated bluff to establish an impenetrable perimeter around her new life. The operative finally replied with a single, respectful word acknowledging her terrifying, untouchable supremacy. Clara locked her tablet, scooped the massive diamonds deep into her wool coat pocket, and confidently walked over to the shattered office window. She looked out over the massive, expensive King County estate that she now owned free and clear, heavily funded by her enemy's dirty money. She had transformed from a discarded, betrayed wife into an absolute, apex predator. Suddenly, the heavy brass knocker on her massive front door echoed loudly through the silent, empty house. It was definitely not the local locksmith she had scheduled to arrive later that afternoon. Peering cautiously through the compromised digital security feed on her smartphone, Clara saw a professional courier standing on her wet porch, holding a highly secure legal envelope explicitly bearing the official seal of the United States Department of Justice. Clara walked down the sweeping oak staircase, her leather boots echoing with absolute, undeniable authority against the bare wood. She opened the heavy front door, greeting the professional courier with a calm, perfectly composed expression. She signed the digital datapad with a smooth flourish and took the thick, sealed envelope bearing the intimidating, highly recognizable eagle crest of the United States Department of Justice. Closing the heavy oak door against the damp, freezing Seattle morning, she carried the thick parchment into the ruined kitchen and sliced it open with a sharp silver letter opener she found discarded in a dusty drawer. The official federal document was the final, flawless puzzle piece in her massive orchestration of absolute revenge. It was a formal notification from the elite cybercrimes division and the lead federal prosecutor operating out of Washington state. The entirely fabricated cyberterrorism complaint Mark had desperately filed against her just hours before his violent abduction had been officially dismissed with extreme prejudice. The federal agents had successfully raided his business, discovered his massive offshore money laundering network, and immediately classified him as a highly dangerous federal fugitive who had completely vanished to avoid inevitable federal prosecution. Clara was entirely cleared of all suspected wrongdoing, the document officially declaring her a completely innocent victim of a massive corporate fraud scheme, effectively erasing her entirely from the massive federal radar. She placed the crisp federal letter onto the gray, dust-covered granite counter, feeling a massive, suffocating weight permanently lift from her tired shoulders. She was completely, unconditionally free. She still possessed the explosive political blackmail ledger securely hidden in her coat, the massive titanium cryptocurrency wallet holding $8 million, and the flawless, untraceable conflict diamonds, safely tucked inside her heavy pockets. She had successfully navigated a terrifying, incredibly lethal maze of aggressive federal agents, ruthless political syndicates, and a deeply treacherous family, emerging entirely untouched and significantly, massively wealthier. Over the next several agonizingly slow weeks, the massive King County estate underwent a drastic, highly expensive and completely transformative renovation. Clara utilized a carefully laundered fraction of her newly acquired decentralized fortune to hire the most aggressive, highly efficient private architectural firm in the entire Pacific Northwest. She did not merely repair the damaged drywall or replace the ruined carpets. She aggressively gutted the entire residential structure down to the foundational wooden studs. She was entirely erasing every single physical memory of Mark and his cruel, deeply manipulative mother from the premises, permanently removing their toxic stain from her beautiful property. The luxurious suburban family home was rapidly converted into a highly secure, state-of-the-art technological fortress. Clara installed military-grade biometric security scanners at every entrance, shatterproof ballistic glass windows, and an entirely independent, highly encrypted satellite communication network on the reinforced roof. She converted the massive basement into a climate-controlled server farm, complete with independent geothermal power generators to ensure her network would never go dark. This was no longer a domestic sanctuary built for a fake, emotionally hollow marriage. It was the impenetrable global headquarters for her brand new, highly elite independent cybersecurity consulting firm. She was stepping out of the shadows of her traditional corporate engineering job and building a massive, unstoppable digital empire entirely on her own unforgiving terms. Sitting at her massive new glass desk overlooking the lush, beautifully manicured backyard, Clara opened her encrypted tablet for one final, highly satisfying status check on the miserable people who had arrogantly tried to destroy her life. She effortlessly bypassed the municipal surveillance firewalls of the city of Seattle, tapping directly into the massive, sprawling network of public security cameras. She rapidly filtered the advanced facial recognition software, actively searching for the entirely broken remnants of her former family. The sophisticated software instantly generated a positive match near the crumbling industrial waterfront district. The high-definition digital feed displayed Eleanor, completely stripped of her arrogant, wealthy high society persona. The older woman was wearing a highly soiled, oversized charitable donation coat, standing miserably in a massive, chaotic line outside a crowded municipal homeless shelter. She looked incredibly frail, utterly defeated, and entirely invisible to the wealthy Seattle citizens walking briskly past her in their expensive business suits. She desperately tried to beg for spare change from a passing businessman, but he entirely ignored her, treating her exactly like the discarded trash she truly was. Her massive, $2 million retirement fund remained permanently locked in a highly secure federal evidence vault, entirely out of her desperate reach forever. Clara smoothly switched the surveillance feed to the Central Greyhound bus terminal located in the gritty, dangerous heart of the downtown sector. The camera captured the young pregnant mistress, dragging a single, heavily scuffed suitcase toward a cheap, cross-country departure gate. She was counting crumpled dollar bills to buy a cheap vending machine sandwich, looking completely exhausted and entirely broken. She had completely abandoned her luxurious, stolen fantasy life, entirely terrified of the federal authorities and the ruthless political syndicate. She was fleeing the state of Washington with absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes on her back and a highly uncertain, deeply terrifying future, effectively erased from Clara's victorious new reality. As for Mark, his exact physical location remained a dark, terrifying mystery, securely held by the ruthless Olympia political operatives operating far outside the law. Clara knew with absolute, chilling certainty that he was permanently chained in a lightless, soundproof concrete basement, endlessly regretting the catastrophic moment he decided to betray a brilliant master software architect. He arrogantly assumed she would simply cry and quietly fade away like a weak, traditional victim. Instead, she had methodically and ruthlessly dismantled his entire universe, legally locked him out of his own life, and deliberately fed him directly to the most dangerous, lethal predators in the entire country. Clara closed the encrypted surveillance terminal, entirely satisfied with the absolute, irreversible destruction of her bitter enemies. She leaned back in her expensive ergonomic leather chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her hot, premium dark roast coffee. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy, gray Seattle storm clouds, casting a bright, brilliant golden light across her massive, highly secure office. She had survived the absolute worst emotional betrayal imaginable, completely rewriting her own destiny with cold, flawless precision and an unyielding, unbreakable will. The ultimate digital game was permanently over, and Clara remained the absolute undisputed queen of the board.